So I just got a question from Jay Costley, and his YouTube channel is still there, Jay Costley. But you also have the cosplay channel, which is called what? Cosplay with a Conscience. I forget. Sorry, cruelty-free cosplay. Cruelty-free. That's it. Cruelty-free cosplay. Cosplay with a Conscience is also a good type. Anyway, he was just asking me about the role of dignity, I guess, in my own philosophy and in my own preaching within veganism. Now, what strikes me as interesting is you were just asking me this long question, which is cool. I'm not complaining and saying it's long. But he asked me this question, in the first 90%, you were talking about the difficulty of expressing to other people this concept of dignity as it applies to animals, as it applies to, domesticated animals, animals in zoos, pets, but I guess also farm animals, right? Especially, though, because you've been talking to people who don't have your background working with animals hands-on. So, Jay, I've done a bunch of videos with them, and they're great. The zoo, the last video we did talking about zoos was really great. When I listened to it back, it was better than I remembered it being. But, Jay has worked in zoos, and he has a lot of hands-on experience with animals in a lot of strange situations, including in zoos the inevitability of animals being executed and put down, and animals being cared for when they're sick, and all the strange, uncomfortable gray areas you get into in caring for animals in captivity. But you switched the direction of your question in the end, and you kind of started asking about dignity for humans. So you asked kind of in the context of human beings, is the problem that the concept of dignity is too abstract? But I think before that, what you were struggling with was how do you communicate to people who don't have the hands-on experience with animals what dignity means in these things, yeah? So you want me to talk about both, or do you want to clarify? Okay, cool. So I'm going to just roll with it.
I just wonder if it's hard for people to process like what you're
Yeah.
saying when you're talking about them.
Yeah,
Because it
yeah,
is a
yeah,
little
yeah, yeah. Well, okay, so for animals, this is my snappy but sincere answer. If you take an elephant and you cut its tusks off, have you deprived it of its dignity? If you take an elephant and you cut its tail off, have you deprived it of its dignity? If you take an elephant and you cut its trunk off, you cut its nose off, have you deprived it of its dignity? All these things really happen. These are not hypothetical examples in places like Laos and Cambodia. These things really happen. They happen for various reasons. And it's a real question whether or not you just kill this animal or what after various stages of this kind of injury and dignity are endured. I ask a fundamentally different question. I ask, when you've cut an animal off from the wilderness, have you deprived it of its dignity? And what I really insist on is that I'm not talking about an idealized wilderness. I'm just talking about the actual wilderness, which includes, being torn apart by wolves and dying of dysentery and all that stuff. I'm not talking about an idealized. I'm not talking about an Arcadia. I'm not talking about a Garden of Eden. I'm talking about the brutal, grim reality of being in the wilderness, or, as I talked about in an earlier video today, even animals living feral, where you're talking about, rabbits that are feral living in a city. Well, we just saw that here in Victoria. Now I can get into more detail. I know right now I'm talking to the converted, but you were talking about the difficulty when you deal with people who haven't thought this through and don't have this kind of experience. For me, little tactile examples, like when I question for people, when you pet your dog on the head, do you think that in the wild, dogs pet one another on the head? And they have to stop. It's like, no. So this gesture, petting, like you've never seen a dog take its paw and pet another dog on the head. You've never seen a wolf do that in the wild, right? That's not so it's meaningful. Now, why do I use that kind of example? It's not just to make someone feel like a jerk. It's because for me, part of what's being cut off here, before we get to cutting off the tail or cutting off the trunk or cutting off one leg or what have you, what you're cutting this animal off from is its socialization within its own species. And in a weird sense, that's even true of solitary predators, right? Obviously, cutting it off from reproducing with its own species, cutting it off from competing with its own species, socializing with its own species. But even something like that, a little example like that, I think it really does emblematize or tokenize what's really a deeper problem here of what it is I mean by dignity. Because as you know, I talk about a life of dignity, I talk about death dignity. Like for this dog or for this wolf, whatever dignity it's going to seek out is going to be competing in its own kind, right? It's not a dignity I can confer by patting it on the head and saying good dog. And the reason why this is a challenge that you have to talk about with people is that their identity is, sorry, their mentality is 180 degrees the opposite. They think the dignity of animals is something that human beings provide to animals, the same way we provide them with a bowl of food or a roof over their head or shelter or what have you. In the same way a human being can pet a dog on the head and say good dog, or make the dog happy, or play with the dog, give it a treat. And this is exactly what they think of as dignity, treating an animal with dignity or giving it dignity. And what I'm saying is no, when you're cutting that dog off from the kind of approval it seeks or it would seek in the wild from its own kind, or even in hunting prey and in all these things, that is actually what's cutting off its dignity. Now, what's really interesting is to then turn this around and say, well, gee, Eisel, how does your philosophy apply to human beings, right? And I think it actually does apply pretty consistently, because I think the reality is when you take a human being and put them in solitary confinement in prison, even if they're treated well, even if they're fed good food, I think we correctly see this as depriving a human being of their dignity. Now, I'm not saying we should never put people in prison. I'm not. I'm pointing out that even if you approve of it, you look at someone and you say, okay, this person's a mass murderer, they're a danger to society, we're going to take them and put them in solitary confinement. I think that people are aware, without being able to define it or put their finger on it, something has happened here. Something that's more significant than just sitting in a room voluntarily. Tonight, for example, I may sit in front of the computer alone for many hours. My girlfriend's in the background, you can see. I'm not completely alone. But nevertheless, if I choose to sit alone at my computer, that is actually something very different from me being cut off from the society of my own species, and being cut off permanently. That there is something here being cut away, and maybe it's not as obvious as your tail or your trunk or your tusks or your claws, like animals being declawed, but that there is something fundamental here that tokens, that betokens, that emblematizes what I'm getting at by dignity. I don't just think there's dignity in life, there's dignity in death and dignity in dying. And I don't just think there's dignity in success. You can talk about the dignity of poverty, the dignity of failure, of saying, look, I started this business, I ran it my way, and I ran it into the ground, and now I'm poor because my business is a failure. You know what I mean? Like, I think that concept of dignity, again, unfortunately, these words don't have a negative connotation. But I think dignity is, in a sense, linked to competition, in that same sense that the wolf competes among wolves and the elephant competes among elephants, and human beings compete among human beings, often without knowing why. Back when I was a Pali scholar, I was a scholar of Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist history, etc. I remember I had a really weird debate with another guy who was also a philosopher, historian, linguist, working on ancient Buddhism, the same stuff. He described his engagement with Buddhism as altruistic. And I said, no, for me it's not altruistic at all. I would even describe it as egoistic, why I'm involved. And he was really shocked by that, and I had to explain. It was really this same philosophy I'm explaining here and now, where I said, no, for me, even just the fact that I want to go to a conference, and I really want to present my views, my research, my discoveries to the other people at the conference, and I want to disagree with them even. I don't just want them to applaud. I want to prove my case, and I want that interaction. So that's not altruistic. I think that's egoistic in the strictest sense. I think when I go to that conference, and even if it's literally Buddhist philosophy, it's like, hey guys, here's what I did in the last 5 years researching these ancient Buddhist texts, and now I'm going to prove my case, and you're welcome to disagree with me and debate with me. We are a wolf pack, tearing apart a corpse, and we are a herd of elephants competing for who gets to mate or who gets to drink water from the brook, or competing without even knowing why. I think elephants fight with other elephants just because of the instincts that are in them and the feelings that are in them. Wolves fight with other wolves too, without maybe knowing why. I'd like to think I'm doing it about something meaningful. If I'm doing it about politics or philosophy or history, or I don't want to compete with other people about just who has bigger muscles or who has a fancier car. But nevertheless, I recognize that in other people, the guys who are spending their time having big muscles and a fancy car, I think for them, that is precisely the pursuit of their dignity. And not because it's something innate in the clothing or the car or the muscles, but because of this competitive relationship with one's own species. And in a world where the wilderness has almost been totally destroyed, that may be one of the last feeders for the natural instincts to play themselves out that we have left. And on some level, I think we appreciate that, even though the cars are meaningless and maybe even the conversations we may have are meaningless. That there's really something interestingly profound we're deprived of when we're put into solitary confinement. And it doesn't take that much of a leap of inference for people to see that you're doing that, and so much worse and so much more, when you do that to a dog, when you do that to a cat, and you cut off the cat's testicles, and you cut off its claws. You deprive it of its own species. And I don't think it's too much to say in the same sense. You're depriving it of its dignity.